Sometimes life does not fall apart to destroy you. Sometimes it falls apart so something better can finally begin. I did not believe those words when the worst week of my life started. At 29 years old, I thought I had everything figured out. I had a marketing career in Boston, a beautiful apartment overlooking the Charles River, and a fiancé I had spent 4 years planning a future with. From the outside, my life looked stable, successful, predictable. Then Monday arrived. My manager called me into a conference room at 9 in the morning. 10 minutes later, I walked out carrying a cardboard box filled with personal belongings. Company restructuring, they said. Budget cuts. Nothing personal. By noon I was unemployed. I spent the afternoon sitting in my car staring at the city skyline through the windshield, trying to convince myself it would be fine. People lost jobs every day. I would find another one. I still had Ethan. Not Ethan Foster. Ethan was the man I was supposed to marry, or so I thought. On Wednesday evening, I came home early after a networking event was canceled. The apartment was quiet except for distant music coming from the living room. At first I smiled. I thought he was home relaxing. Then I walked through the doorway and realized there was someone else there. Nothing dramatic happened. No shouting. No scene. Just the sudden, devastating realization that the future I had imagined no longer existed. By the time I left the apartment that night, my engagement was over. For years gone. Just like that. I spent the next 2 days sleeping on my friend Rachel's couch while trying to figure out what came next. Then Friday arrived. The final blow. My savings account looked healthy until I remembered something important. My income had disappeared. My apartment lease was ending. My expenses were not. After hours of calculations and uncomfortable conversations with my landlord, reality became impossible to ignore. I could not afford to stay. The apartment that had once felt like a symbol of independence suddenly became another thing I was losing. 7 days. That was all it took. 7 days to lose my job, my relationship, and my home. By Sunday night, I sat alone inside my aging Honda Civic in a grocery store parking lot. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. A single street lamp cast pale yellow light across the empty rows of cars. My phone was silent. My future was uncertain. For the first time in my adult life, I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do next. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. The exhaustion went deeper than being tired. Felt like grief. Grief for the life I thought I was going to have. Grief for the woman I thought I was becoming. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the dark sky. I remember staring through the rain-covered glass and wondering how everything could disappear so quickly. What I did not know then was that losing everything was not the end of my story. It was only the end of the chapter that had been holding me back. The next morning I drove north with everything I still owned packed into the back of my car. 2 suitcases. 3 cardboard boxes. A few framed photographs I was not ready to throw away. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me while Boston slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. I had no grand plan. No exciting opportunity waiting at the end of the trip. Just a small town called Rock Harbor on the coast of Maine, and a room I had rented online because it was one of the few places I could still afford. The drive took almost 5 hours. By the time I crossed into Maine, the landscape had changed completely. Busy streets and crowded buildings gave way to forests, rocky shorelines, and small towns where everyone seemed to know each other. The ocean appeared beside the road in flashes of silver beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time in days, I felt something other than sadness. It was not happiness. Not yet. But maybe it was relief. When I finally arrived in Rock Harbor, the town looked exactly like the photographs I had seen online. Small shops lined the main street. Fishing boats rested in the harbor. Seagulls circled above the water. Life seemed slower here. Quieter. Almost untouched by the rush that had defined my old life. My rental room sat above a used bookstore near the waterfront. The building was old enough that the wooden stairs creaked beneath every step. The owner, a friendly woman named Margaret, greeted me with a warm smile and handed me a brass key. "The room is not fancy," she said, "but it is clean." She was right. The room was tiny. A narrow bed stood against one wall. A small desk sat beside a single window overlooking the harbor. The furniture looked older than I was. The paint was slightly faded. But when I opened the window, cool ocean air filled the room. I could hear waves in the distance. Somehow that felt more valuable than luxury. After unpacking a few essentials, I sat on the edge of the bed and reviewed my bank account for what felt like the 100th time. The numbers still made my stomach tighten. I needed work soon. Very soon. That evening I walked through town searching for job postings. Most opportunities were part-time positions at local businesses. Nothing close to the career I had spent years building. Yet for the first time, pride no longer seemed important. Survival was. As the sun began to set, I stopped near the harbor and watched the sky turn shades of orange and gold above the water. Fishing boats drifted gently with the tide. Families strolled along the docks. Life continued moving forward. I wrapped my jacket tighter against the evening breeze and stared across the ocean. A week earlier, I would have called this situation a disaster. Standing there, I was not so sure. Everything familiar was gone. Everything comfortable had disappeared. But somewhere beneath the fear and uncertainty, a small voice whispered something I had not felt in a long time. Possibility. The first week in Rock Harbor settled into a routine I never would have imagined for myself. Every morning I woke to the sound of seagulls outside my window instead of traffic. Every morning I reminded myself that starting over was supposed to feel uncomfortable. After sending out dozens of job applications with little success, I accepted temporary work helping organize events for the town community center. The pay was modest. The office was small. Nothing about it resembled the career I had left behind. Yet there was something strangely comforting about being useful again. On my third morning, I stopped at a small coffee shop across from the harbor before work. The place smelled like fresh pastries and roasted coffee beans. Locals greeted each other by name. Everyone seemed connected in ways I did not yet understand. I ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu and found a seat near the window. That was when I noticed him for the first time. He sat alone at a corner table reading a newspaper. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed simply in a navy sweater and dark slacks. There was nothing flashy about him. No obvious signs of wealth. Yet something about the way he carried himself stood out. Calm, confident, comfortable. Like a man who had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. A few minutes later, an elderly woman entered the shop carrying too many bags. Before anyone else reacted, the man stood and helped her find a table. He spoke quietly. She smiled. Then he returned to his seat as if the gesture had been nothing special. I found myself watching longer than I intended. When our eyes accidentally met, I looked away immediately, embarrassed. The next morning he was there again. Same table. Same coffee. Same newspaper. By the end of the week, I realized he appeared every day at almost exactly the same time. On Friday, the only empty seat in the crowded cafe happened to be across from him. I hesitated before approaching. "Is this seat taken?" I asked. He folded his newspaper and smiled politely. "Not unless you can see someone sitting there." I laughed despite myself. Fair point. I sat down. For a few minutes we drank our coffee in silence. Surprisingly, it was not awkward. Finally, he glanced toward the harbor outside the window. "You are new here." It was not a question. Am I that obvious? Only to people who have lived here a long time. His eyes carried a warmth that immediately put me at ease. "I am Daniel." "Olivia." We shook hands. The conversation realized something unusual had happened. For the first time since arriving in Rock Harbor, I had spent an entire hour without thinking about everything I had lost. And as I walked toward the community center, I found myself wondering whether I might see Daniel again tomorrow. Over the next few weeks, seeing Daniel became part of my routine. Every morning around 7:30, we found ourselves in the same coffee shop overlooking the harbor. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes an hour disappeared before either of us noticed. What surprised me most was how easy the conversations felt. Daniel never asked questions that made me uncomfortable. He never pushed me to explain parts of my life I was not ready to discuss. Somehow he always seemed to know exactly how much space to give someone. One rainy Tuesday morning, I arrived at the community center to discover complete chaos. A major fundraising event scheduled for the following month was falling apart. A sponsor had withdrawn support. Several volunteers had canceled. The director looked exhausted. Everyone seemed overwhelmed. I spent most of the morning helping reorganize schedules and contacting local businesses. By lunchtime, I had accidentally slipped back into the kind of strategic planning work I used to do in Boston. The difference was that nobody here expected perfection. They were simply grateful for help. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by the community center carrying a folder. At first I assumed he was making a donation or attending a meeting. Instead, he spent nearly an hour speaking with the director about a literacy initiative the town hoped to launch. Before leaving, he found me sorting paperwork in a conference room. "You seem busy," he said. "Busy is better than worrying," I replied. "Something more." Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is not as far away as you think." The next morning, Daniel asked if I would be interested in helping with a regional community development project. I immediately assumed he meant volunteer work. "I am not sure I have much to offer right now," I admitted. "I disagree." His answer came so quickly that I laughed. "You do not even know my work history." "Actually," he said calmly, "I know enough." I stared at him. "That sounds mysterious." "It is not meant to." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I simply think talented people sometimes forget their own value." The words lingered in my thoughts long after he left. 2 days later, he introduced me to several people involved in a coastal revitalization project designed to support local businesses and community programs. Nobody treated me like a charity case. Nobody looked at me with pity. They asked for my ideas. They listened. Overhead. "You look different," he said as I sat down. "Different good or different bad?" I asked. "Definitely good." I smiled into my coffee cup. "That is reassuring." He studied me for a moment. "You seem lighter." The observation surprised me because it was true. For months I had carried grief everywhere I went. Now the weight felt smaller. Not gone. Just easier to carry. "I think I am finally starting to believe my life is not over," I admitted. Daniel nodded. Fell apart. I was no longer looking backward. I was looking forward. And somehow, without even noticing when it happened, I had started imagining Daniel in that future. The truth arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. That was the strange thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. I had spent most of the day helping coordinate a regional planning meeting at a waterfront conference center just outside town. Representatives from several organizations attended, along with business leaders and community partners. I was organizing presentation materials when one of the event coordinators approached me carrying a program booklet. "You know Daniel Foster, right?" she asked casually. "Of course. Then he will probably want to sit near the front." I glanced down at the booklet she handed me. The cover listed keynote speakers for the afternoon session. My eyes stopped on the first name. Daniel Foster, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Foster Development Group. Investment and creating opportunities for people who had been overlooked. There was nothing flashy about the speech. No ego. No self-congratulation. Just thoughtful leadership and genuine conviction. When the presentation ended, people gathered around him almost immediately. Executives, investors, public officials. Watching from across the room, I suddenly felt foolish. What exactly had I imagined? That the man spending mornings in a small coffee shop had nothing else in his life? For the rest of the afternoon I avoided him. Not intentionally at first. Then absolutely intentionally. That was one Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing a meeting when my phone vibrated. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Ethan. My former fiancé. For a moment I simply stared at it. Nearly a year had passed since the night everything fell apart. Nearly a year since I had walked away from the life we planned together. He had not called once during that time. Not on birthdays. Not on holidays. Not even to apologize. Yet there his name was. I almost declined the call. Instead, curiosity won. "Hello." Silence lingered for a second. "Olivia." Hearing his voice felt strangely distant, like listening to someone from another lifetime. "I heard you are doing well." Of course he had. News traveled quickly once people became successful. "I am doing fine," I replied. "That is good." Another pause followed. "I was hoping we could talk." The request stirred emotions I thought had disappeared months ago. Not love. Not anger. Just disbelief. Why now? I asked quietly. His answer came slowly. Because I made a mistake. I looked out the office window toward the gray ocean beyond town. For nearly a year I had imagined hearing those words. Now that they finally arrived, they felt surprisingly empty. You did, I said. He asked if we could meet. I declined. Politely. Firmly. When the call ended, I expected to feel shaken. Instead, I felt calm. That surprised me more than the call itself. 2 days later, another surprise arrived. A former colleague from Boston emailed me about a senior marketing position at a prestigious company. The salary was impressive. The opportunity was significant. Suddenly, people who had ignored my ideas months earlier were interested in my experience again. The pattern became impossible to miss. Success had changed how others viewed me. It had not changed who I was. That evening, I met Daniel at the coffee shop after closing. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while holiday lights reflected across the harbor. He listened quietly as I described the phone call and the job offer. How do you feel? He asked. I thought about the question carefully. Stronger than I used to. A smile appeared in his eyes. That sounds like progress. I laughed softly. A year ago, I would have spent weeks wondering if I should go back. And now? I looked out toward the water. The answer came easily. Now I know why I left. Daniel nodded as though he had expected exactly that response. The conversation shifted to other subjects after that, but something important had changed inside me. The people who once walked away were beginning to return. Not because I needed them, because they finally saw the value that had been there all along. And for the first time in my life, I no longer needed their recognition to believe it myself. January arrived with an unexpected decision. The senior marketing position in Boston remained on the table. The company had increased the salary offer twice. Recruiters called every week. Friends from my old life insisted I would be crazy to refuse it. On paper, the opportunity looked perfect. Prestigious title. Excellent compensation. A direct path back into the career I once thought defined me. A year earlier, I would have accepted immediately. Now I was not so sure. One snowy morning, I sat alone in the coffee shop staring at the official offer letter. Outside, Rock Harbor moved at its usual pace. Fishing boats drifted through the harbor. Shop owners swept snow from sidewalks. Life felt familiar here in a way I never expected. The problem was not the job. The problem was what accepting it would mean. It would mean leaving the community projects I helped build. Leaving the people who had become friends. Leaving the small town that somehow taught me how to breathe again. Most of all, it would mean leaving Daniel. The realization settled quietly inside me. For months I had convinced myself our connection was simply friendship, respect, gratitude, something safe and uncomplicated. Yet every time I imagined leaving, his face appeared first. Later that afternoon, I drove to a coastal overlook just outside town. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a pale winter sky. Daniel found me there an hour later. I was not surprised. Somehow he always seemed to know when I needed company. Big decision? He asked as he sat beside me on the wooden bench. I handed him the offer letter. He read it carefully before returning it. It is impressive. That is the problem. He looked at me with quiet curiosity. Explain. I stared toward the horizon. For so long I thought success meant getting back everything I lost. The wind carried strands of hair across my face. Now I am not sure I want my old life back. Daniel remained silent, giving me space to continue. What if I worked so hard to rebuild myself that I forgot to ask what kind of life I actually wanted? The question lingered between us. Finally he spoke. Then you are asking the right question. I laughed softly. That is not very helpful. A smile appeared in his eyes. Sometimes clarity matters more than certainty. We sat together watching waves crash against the rocky shoreline below. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then Daniel turned toward me. Olivia, if you choose Boston, I will support that decision. My chest tightened unexpectedly. And if I stay? His expression softened. Then I will support that decision too. There was no pressure. No attempt to influence me. Only trust. In that moment I understood something important. The strongest relationships are not built on control. They are built on freedom. That evening I returned to my apartment above the bookstore and stared out at the harbor lights reflecting across the water. For the first time since losing everything, the future stood completely open before me. And as I looked toward the town that had given me a second chance, I realized the most important choice was not about a job. It was about deciding where I truly belonged. 3 days later, I declined the Boston offer. The decision surprised almost everyone except me. Friends called to ask if I was making a mistake. Recruiters tried one last time to change my mind. Even Rachel sounded shocked when I told her. Yet the moment I sent the email, an incredible sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in years, I was not choosing a life based on expectations. I was choosing a life that actually felt right. Spring arrived gradually in Rock Harbor. Snow melted from the sidewalks. Boats returned to the harbor in greater numbers. Outdoor cafes reopened. The town seemed to wake from a long sleep, and somehow I felt the same way. The community projects continued growing. New partnerships formed across the region. The work challenged me every day, but it also energized me. More importantly, I no longer measured success by titles, salaries, or city skylines. I measured it by purpose. One evening in late April, the town hosted a celebration near the waterfront to recognize volunteers and local leaders who had contributed to community development efforts. Families filled the harbor promenade. Music drifted through the cool evening air. Strings of lights glowed above the crowd. As the sun began to set, golden reflections danced across the water. I stood near the dock speaking with friends when I noticed Daniel walking toward me. Something about his expression immediately caught my attention. Calm, warm, slightly nervous. "Can we take a walk?" he asked. I smiled. Of course. We followed the shoreline away from the crowd until the sounds of the celebration faded behind us. The sky glowed with shades of orange and pink above the ocean. For a few minutes we walked in comfortable silence. Then Daniel stopped near a familiar wooden bench overlooking the water. The same place where we had shared countless conversations over the past year. "Olivia," he said softly, "there is something I have wanted to tell you for a long time." My heart immediately began racing. Daniel looked toward the horizon before meeting my eyes again. "When we first met, I admired your resilience. Then I admired your kindness. Then your intelligence. Somewhere along the way, admiration became something much deeper. Emotion caught in my throat. The ocean breeze stirred gently around us. You changed my life," he continued. "Not because you needed saving. Because you reminded me what truly matters. You taught me that success means very little if there is nobody meaningful to share it with." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Daniel reached for my hand. "I do not know what the future looks like," he said, "but I know I want you in it." I smiled through tears. "That is good," I whispered, "because I want the same thing." The relief and happiness that crossed his face was something I would never forget. As the last light of day settled across the harbor, I realized how much had changed in a single year. I arrived in Rock Harbor believing my life was over. Instead, I found purpose, friendship, healing, and love. The career I lost had forced me to discover who I really was. The future I lost had made room for one I never could have imagined. And standing beside Daniel with the ocean stretching endlessly before us, I finally understood something simple and beautiful. Sometimes losing everything is exactly how life leads you to what was meant for you all along.